Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is at tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on the website, you can pick up revision guides and flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And in that respect, this episode goes right back to the very start of sociology and understanding one of the very basic terms, and that's the term of socialization. Socialization tends to be talked about in two forms: primary socialization and secondary socialization. Primary socialization tends to take place in the first few years of someone's life, normally between 0 and 3, maybe up to about the age of 5. And this is where you learn the very basics of what you need to do as a human being. So being able to walk and talk and learn manners and start to interact with people. And so remember, the agent of socialization at this stage is your parents or your guardian or whoever is looking after you. So the important part of primary socialization is it's just learning the very basics, the essential practices of what is needed to be a functioning human being. Remember, it's the process of understanding acceptable forms of behavior in any given society. And so this is really fundamental, the primary stage, because this is where you form the building blocks of how your life is going to progress. And we know from examples such as feral children that if primary socialization isn't particularly effective, or many things haven't been taught at that stage, it has negative connotations for much later on in life. For example, it's often considered that the first 5 years of your life is called the critical period for understanding language. And if you're not taught or you don't understand language and communication at that stage, it becomes much more difficult to understand it later on in life. So primary socialization, first few years of your life, and your agent of socialization there is your family. Secondary socialization starts at about the age of 4, 5, and it goes on throughout your life. And secondary socialization is once you get a little bit older and you start to go to school, you start to pick up on the media, and then later on you may start to understand things like religion and government and so on. So secondary socialization is a much longer period of time, but you're also learning from a much wider range of agencies of socialization. During the secondary stage, you then start to pick up a much better understanding of life, interaction, thinking about what your friends say. You might start to form political opinions. You start to get allegiances with different factors and understanding as well. So secondary socialization is an ongoing, lifelong impact that builds on the basis of your primary socialization. So to understand socialization a little bit better, we're going to hear from American sociologist Eric Miller, who will guide you through the basics of socialization, also consider the importance of gender in the socialization process, and also look at that really important argument that you may have done when you first started sociology, the nature-nurture debate. Enjoy.
Socialization is simply the process by which we learn our culture. So a couple important parts of that definition. It is a process. It happens over time. It isn't something that you accomplish just when you're born and then you're done with it. It's something that goes on throughout your life. And it is how we learn our particular culture. So whatever culture you're raised in, that's the one you're going to be socialized into. You're not going to be socialized into the culture of a country where you don't live, obviously. Socialization is that lifelong process where you learn the culture where you live. And actually that can change as you get older. You know, the culture that you learn when you're a little kid might be different than the one that you're learning when you're 50 years old. When you're 50, you're learning how to be a 50-year-old in this culture rather than a child. And so you're actually getting different kinds of socialization. But all of that together, that process, that lifelong process where you're learning all about your culture is what we mean by socialization. Agents of socialization. Agents of socialization are simply those groups that teach you your culture. They're the people who perform the socialization. And there are several of these. The first one, and the most important for you when you're a child, is the family. In fact, the family probably gives you more about how you're supposed to act in society than anyone else up until you become a young adult. As a young adult, all of a sudden the school gets into the act, and you learn a lot in schools about what it means to do things like stand in line and get along with other people in large groups and share toys and that sort of thing. And so you learn a lot about how to fit into society from your school as you get a little older. And then as you get a little older still, it may switch to your peers that are doing most of the socialization. And so you'll look to your friends or other people that you perceive as being similar to you, which is what peers are, and you'll look to them to see how to act. And particularly in our teenage years, our adolescence, for most people, peers become very important. It's not like the family or schools disappear. They're still there. It's just which one seems to be most important for learning about your culture at that particular time. For many people, it's peers. And then also, you have to talk about the media. How much of what you learn about fitting in society comes from television and movies and music and the internet and YouTube videos. I mean, all this stuff, all this media we're inundated with, we learn a lot about what it means to be part of our society from watching that media. And so these are just a few examples. For other people, you could put down your church or maybe your job as other agents of socialization. There are lots of them. And different people will have different ones that are more important to them. But these are four that almost everyone has over time that really teaches you your culture. There are lots of different kinds of socialization, different ways that you learn to act in society. But probably the most important one is learning what it means to be male or female in our society. If you don't believe me, just go watch some commercials on TV and look at how many subtle and not so subtle messages you're getting about how you're supposed to act as a boy or a girl or a man or a woman in our society. And we get these from the time we're a tiny little baby. They've done studies with nurses and delivery room nurses and how they treat babies differently depending on whether they're boys and girls. And with the girls, they're much more gentle. They say things like, "Oh, what a pretty little girl you are," and "Oh, aren't you the cutest thing?" And you're such a look at your little fingers. You're such a delicate little flower. You know, they say these kind of things. But with boys, they're still gentle with them. But they say things like, "Oh, who's the big strong boy?" And they'll talk about how strong his grip is when he grasps their finger and that sort of thing. And they'll handle the baby a little rougher if it's a boy. They're more likely to swing him a little bigger in their arms, etc. And so we start getting very subtle messages from the time we're tiny little babies about the difference between boys and girls. And then as we're growing up, we're given different toys and we're told how to dress. And if we dress inappropriately for our gender, we get made fun of, or we get told that that's not how little boys dress or that's not how little girls dress. For little boys, this can be particularly strong because it's more acceptable to be a tomboy than it is a sissy. And so even the words themselves have those different connotations that came up in your head when I just said them. They mean basically the same thing, which is that you're exhibiting characteristics usually associated with the other gender. But for little girls, being a tomboy is not nearly as negative as little boys being called a sissy. But anyway, you really start to learn these things at a very young age, and they continue all the way up until your adulthood. You're still being told the way women and men are supposed to act, and you're still, by and large, buying into that, unless you're a person who has come to identify in some way with the other gender, which can happen. And we all, have levels of identification with the other gender. Males have a feminine side, females have a male side, etc. But it varies from person to person exactly how much of that there is. And if you cross a line, you're going to meet social disapproval. And you may, people certainly learn to live with that. But you are going to get social disapproval if you cross that gender line. And what the nature-nurture debate has to do with is exactly how we become the person that we become, how we develop our personality and our skills and all of those good things that we get as we get older. And the nature side of things would argue that it's genetic, that you're born with a blueprint that tells you, what kind of person you're going to become later in life. And that there's really not a lot that can be done about that, as long as you're kept healthy and safe and all that kind of thing, that those genetic predispositions that you have, those genetic structures that you have are going to be expressed. On the nurture side, on the other side of things, is the idea that it's not so much your genetics and your genes and what you get from your parents genetically, biologically, but rather how you're raised, the nurturing part. And this says that it's the environment, that it's the way people treat you and the way that you learn to do things that have more to do with the kind of person you eventually turn out to be than your genetics. And then most people will say, well, it's probably some kind of combination of the two, and that I think is probably true. But most people still will lean more toward one or the other. It's more having more to do with genetics, and your the way that you're raised can influence that. But it really comes down to how you're born, what your genes are. And then on the other side, there's people who say, well, yeah, it matters what your genes are, and that gives you a basic predisposition maybe, but what's really more important is exactly how you're raised. And so if you think that way, you're more on the nurture side of the debate. Obviously in sociology, we tend to be more on the nurture side because that's what we study. And so socialization, that whole process of socialization, could be thought of as the nurture side.
News of an extraordinary child emerged from the Ukraine. A girl had been found living in a farm kennel. For 6 years, she'd been brought up by dogs. Her time in their company profoundly affected her behaviour. For centuries, wild children have fascinated scientists. Raised without love or social interaction, wild or feral children pose questions that go to the heart of what it is to be human. And only now, as scientists study these children, are they gaining unique insights into how we learn and who and what we are.
Children who are found who are in abusive situations, who have been locked in a basement from the time they were little kids and not let out until they were teenagers, very often will act not as you would expect. Say, the most famous of these was a girl who was rescued when she was 16 years old, and she had been raised in a basement from the time she was a baby. And she had never been allowed human contact other than being brought food by her caregiver once a day. She wasn't around other humans at all. And so she never developed any kind of language skills. She never developed what we would consider social skills at all. And so when she came out of that environment, she acted like a wild animal. She had no language other than grunts. She didn't have any sort of what we would call manners. She didn't know how to clean herself. She didn't know how to use the bathroom in a sanitary way. She would just use it in the corner of the room or whatever. And so she acted as we would expect a wild animal to act. And so that's a good argument that it really does matter, the nurture side of things and exactly how you're socialized and how you're brought up, that you can't just become a fully functioning adult based on your genetics, that it has to be, you have to be trained from the time you're a little kid if we expect people to act like human beings. And in fact, you can't even learn language past a certain point. Children are very predisposed to learning language. If you get to be 10 years old and you've never heard speech, human speech in your life, you're probably never going to speak normally. You may pick up a few words, but it turns out that there are critical periods that we go through where we're predisposed, our brains are, to picking up certain things. And for language, we really need to be exposed to human language from about the time we're 1 year old up until we're 4 years old. And that's when a lot of language development is really going on, and that seems to be a critical period for learning that. And if you miss it, you're probably never going to get it.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.